The Withering of Sir Arthur Maine by Eleanor Solstein. Read by Andrew Parrish.
I have, of course, read, as I'm sure many of you will have, that in the unfolding of ghost stories, it is always preferable to allow the main actors in the tale an initial period of normality, that the dread and foreboding integral to such encounters should only make itself evident by degrees, slowly, and over an extended period, stretching its shadowy fingers in a slow, deliberate assault, rather than with a sudden pounce. In constructing works of fiction, I am convinced as to the truth of these guidelines, and would always attempt to mimic them. In unfolding my own tale, however, I fear I am inevitably bound to break them. For in relating my own brief encounter with the supernatural, I am unfortunately encumbered by that meddlesome and intrusive editor we call the truth, and must consequently admit that insofar as I was an actor in the tale, my own period of comfort and normality was displeasingly brief. Perhaps, however, I can be forgiven this point of style, owing not only to the truth of my tale, but the fact that I am not entirely certain it should be deemed a ghost story at all, though in a strange way that you will come to understand, I both hope and pray that it is. So it was that when my colleague first employed me to join him in his study with a promise to show me something that I simply had to see, I was naturally both sceptical and somewhat reluctant. Up until that point, he extended his strange invitation, my friend and I had been comfortably ensconced not in his chambers, where I knew we would be forced to stand, hunching our shoulders against the icy grip of the December drafts, but in my own modest but comfortably fire-warmed rooms, trying as best we could to chase away the creeping melancholy of the season with the liberal application of tobacco, brandy, and conversation, a situation I was neither keen nor in any way intending to leave in any great hurry. I needn't bore the reader by detailing the many topics we traversed over the course of those few hours we shared, save to say that as the candles began to burn down and thoughts of sleep to enter into both of our heads, I happened, with an almost off-hand nonchalance, to mention my burgeoning interest in the subject of folklore. All at once, my companion seemed to regain the vigour he had demonstrated earlier in the evening, clearly excited to share with me some story or anecdote that could be said to fall broadly under that heading. Sitting up in his chair, and after a pause, during which he seemed to consider or momentarily hesitate, he leant conspiratorially forward and bade me to put on my shoes and follow him the short distance to his own chambers, where he promised he had something that might be of interest to you. Naturally, comfortable as I was in my own chambers, and doubtful that the trip would actually be worth the effort, I initially met his request with some reluctance. Though I knew my companion to be a keen collector of ancient artifacts, and was at least passingly aware of his interest in alchemy, magic, and other such esoteric matters, I'd always suspected this interest was the sort of amateurish dabbling in a field outside of their speciality that occupies many a meddling academic's leisure time. He was hardly likely to uncover anything of any great significance, or indeed of any great interest. Eventually, however, I acquiesced and agreed to follow him as long as the visit was brief. As it turned out, it was anything but. For upon seeing and examining that object at close quarters, and having taken a brief and chilling glimpse at its grisly contents, I immediately wanted, nay, needed, some explanation of its origins. So it was that my friend duly lit up a fire of his own, and we two settled into new chairs beside it, while this strange tale unfolded. It was here that my prerequisite period of normality began, sadly, to dissolve. For even then, warming myself and waiting expectantly for the explanation, my interest was somewhat tempered by a strange sense of unease. Though I was in no small part repulsed by the object, I could not, despite my best efforts, prevent myself from periodically glancing back at it, almost checking that it remained where I had placed it. Likewise, there was, it seemed to me, within the room, a curious and muffling sense of closure or encroachment, as if the darkness itself, outside the windows, were now somehow pressing in against them, with a sort of tangible, physical weight. The trees, also, seemed to me to claw and scratch at the casement with far greater malice and intent than they had previously. Whether it was the effects of the brandy, I don't know, but when my companion was forced to leave the room momentarily, busying himself with some preparatory tasks or fetching of refreshments and the like, he left me with an oddly desolate feeling, and I began to nervously wish for his speedy return, so as not to be left alone in there with that thing. Additionally, I do not mind saying that it was with an odd sense of trepidation that I anticipated the short, lonely walk back to my own rooms, and to the darkness that would be waiting for me there. I glanced again at the object, and felt for a moment a great sense of gratitude that the lid had been left closed. The object, I should explain, was a neatly made and ornately carved mahogany box. It was slightly larger than that species of jewellery box one might find on a lady's nightstand, though there was something in the character of the carvings and the somewhat lurid subjects depicted in them that would have made it wholly unsuitable for that purpose. I'm sure that having read the comments above, the reader might well be wondering what it was about this box that could have raised such alarm within me. Why, indeed, was I nervous, perhaps even a little frightened, by what sounds to be a perfectly ordinary trinket? The simple answer is the contents. For within the box, laying on the red velvet covering at a length of no more than 8 inches, and looking for all the world like a child's doll, was a withered but perfectly formed human cadaver. At first glance, the impossibility of the relic's diminutive size led me to take the remains for a fake, possibly a clever contrivance, constructed by a leather which had then been fashioned and stretched across the skeleton of a monkey or a rodent, perhaps an amalgam of the two, a hybrid abomination, stitched or wired together with the skilled artifice displayed by purveyors of sideshow curiosities, of the sort that one would pay a penny to see at a village fete. Upon closer examination, however, I could see instantly that this was not the case, if not from the shape of the features, then from the hideous perfection of the thing's tiny teeth. For through a taut peeling back of the lips, which had ridden up, drawn back like the tide so that they rested at their furthest possible extent, the thing's teeth were revealed, confirming in their shape and distribution that this was indeed a member of the species Homo sapiens sapiens. At this point, my fears increased that perhaps the box's occupant were a child, or worse still, one whom heaven had seen fit to call before entry into this world. The thought repulsed me, but I could see it was also inaccurate, for how would a babe have developed such a perfect set of teeth? Besides which, even my modest knowledge of human anatomy told me that were this a child, the skull would be far larger in comparison to the rest of the body, the spine and the limbs shortened. This again was not the case. Rather, what was presented was the body of a full-grown adult male, its skin mummified, or it seemed to me, sucked onto the bone, as if some vacuum had been created within the body itself. I remember gazing in awe at this fragile thinness of its forearms, wondering at the minute detail of the fingernails in the same way I had when regarding the hands of my newborn nephew. And catching myself in the act of making such a comparison, I felt my own skin tighten and crawl. I closed the lid and placed the thing on a nearby coffee table, hoping as I did that I should never have to see it opened again. When he finally returned, carrying, I was pleased to see, 2 newly poured glasses of brandy, my friend seemed oddly solemn, and taking the seat opposite, let out a deep and weary sigh, which in turn left in its wake a period of silence, into which only the wind, moaning through the eaves, and the insistent crackle of the fire dared to intrude. Before long, however, he took a deep swig from his glass, and began his tale. It was in the spring of 1870 that my friend left the cloistered familiarity of his college for a brief tour of some of the larger stately homes in England. His intention on these visits was to furnish himself with materials for a book he intended to write on the character and contents of the private chapels housed within these homes. To that end, he had secured letters of invitation, and to his great pride, access to a number of previously inaccessible areas and collections. Indeed, he needlessly expended several minutes during the retelling of this tale in explaining some of the less interesting treasure he had uncovered during his tour, which the reader shall no doubt be able to explore, should the fabled volume ever actually make it to print. It was whilst conducting a survey and description of the private chapel at Larsingham Hall in Derbyshire that his attention was drawn to the curious object that now rested not a few feet from where he spoke. Initially, he said, he had almost missed it entirely, for rather than being prominently on display, the small box, as it apparently had since the late 17th century, lay in a small recess or niche set into the middle of the left-hand wall. At first, my friend had taken the recess, carved into the wall itself, to be a trough for votive candles, or perhaps a secondary and curiously positioned baptismal font, or repository for holy water. It was only when he got closer and saw the box resting in the centre of the nook that he decided to ask the priest of the local parish, who had taken on attendant duties from the chapel, and was my friend's guide and companion during the visit, about the curious little item. What struck my friend as odd at the time, before the box had been opened and its curious contents revealed, he said, was that such a large space should have been dedicated to so small an object. For indeed the hollow into which the box was laid was many times larger than the object itself, to the extent that 8 or even 10 similar boxes might have been laid in the space, had there been the need. Above the recess, carved into a small brass plaque, was the name Sir Arthur Maine. A date of 1709 was also ascribed below, though whether this was the date of dedication, the date of Sir Arthur's death, or of some offering, was unclear. The priest, having noticed my friend's interest in the object, was initially reluctant for him to touch it at all, claiming that there were a number of stories within the local area that expressly forbade interference with that object. Though after some extended discussion, he finally acquiesced and allowed my friend both to remove the box from its resting place and to examine its contents. Why the priest experienced such a change of heart, and indeed went to the unthinkable length of allowing my friend to leave Larsingham with the box, isn't known, though I suspect that the substantial contribution my friend made toward the construction of a new steeple for the parish church helped to ameliorate any clinging sense of loss he might have felt at having let the object out of his sight. In point of fact, so keen to help was the priest that he not only allowed my friend to leave with the object, but directed him with some enthusiasm toward the papers and correspondence pertaining to the object and its history within the hall's extensive library. It is here that the unease caused by the thing's physical appearance was increased tenfold by the story of its origin. It is also at this point in the narrative that we are introduced to the unfortunate Mother Eastrom. Sir Arthur Maine occupied Larsingham Hall for close to 15 years in the mid-1700s, during which time he was reported to not only be a man of surging ambition and exacting standards, but also one prone to acts of almost childish petulance and wanton cruelty. In 1741, for example, he was said to have received word that pheasants from his land had crossed over into a number of farms that fringed their borders. It being permissible to hunt animals that crossed outside the perimeter and forbidden for those within the grounds, enterprising locals had taken it upon themselves to weaken the fences surrounding Sir Arthur's land and to lure the birds into their own grounds. This process, whilst undoubtedly underhanded, was not considered illegal, as it was not deemed poaching, nor indeed a crime for a man to hunt on his own land, even if the animal had strayed from some other landowner's property. Unfortunately, Sir Arthur's reaction to this impertinence was also perfectly legal, despite being both cruel and merciless. Within the extensive records housed at the hall, Sir Arthur was able to find an older, and some would argue less accurate, map of the hall and its enclosed grounds to which the lord of the hall had exclusive rights. This map showed the outer boundary to be far further out than more recent maps. Taking, and indeed declaring this as proof that the land now occupied by the farmers had been taken illegally over the previous number of decades, Sir Arthur set about repelling this perceived encroachment by reclaiming these areas in his own name, forcing the farmers off the land and if necessary, leaving their buildings ablaze behind them. The following year, despite there being no reports of either poaching or interference with fences, Sir Arthur decided to once again forcefully evict farmers from the surrounding areas and extend his own dominion, regarding the entire process less as a true need for land than as an assertion of authority and reportedly a source of great amusement. This trend of annual expansion persisted until 1746, when Sir Arthur attempted to reclaim the small plot of land occupied by a local woman known as Mother Eastrom. Returning to the hall that evening, the men ordered to remove Eastrom explained that she had shown them an edict issued by the previous bishop, stating that the land belonging to her was by express order to be left whole and intact, irrespective of disputes around property rights. What prompted the holy man to issue such a command, and indeed whether his intention was to grant favour to Eastrom, or in fact to ensure the safety of those in the surrounding area, is unclear. Though in his subsequent research my friend did uncover a number of unpleasant accusations lobbied at Eastrom, which only a few centuries or decades earlier might have seen her hung on charges of malefice or witchcraft. Indeed, though the details are patchy and assembled from a number of disparate sources, the picture formed of Mother Eastrom is of a deeply affecting character, whom locals thought it wise not to cross. Several documents of the time refer to her house as being constructed almost entirely of blackthorn wood, which, leaving aside the various folkloric associations of that tree, would strike anyone familiar with that species as a difficult material from which to construct a dwelling. Her garden, meanwhile, is said to have contained a veritable retinue of wooden carvings, all of indeterminate origin, depicting men, women, and all manner of curious creatures, whilst the walls around this patch, the only portion of her abode to be made of stone, were etched all over with strange markings that Eastrom could herself be seen adding to and adjusting, though for what purpose we will never know. What we do know is that rather than being dismayed by word of this edict, Sir Arthur was instead excited by it, and began to regard Mother Eastrom's removal from her plot as a personal mission. Within the hall's records there is a document signed by Sir Arthur's own hand and addressed to Mother Eastrom, informing her that she should vacate the property within 1 week, or in his own words, face the consequences. The reason this document remains available to us today and retains a place within the collection rather than the personal effects of Mother Eastrom is because though it was delivered to the intended receiver, it was later returned to the hall with a second message scrawled across the reverse. In it, Mother Eastrom advises Sir Arthur to return to the scriptures that you and your ilk hold so dear, mentioning in particular verses from a Gnostic text known as the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, admonishing Sir Arthur to mind ye well chapter 3, verses 2 and 3, before adding cryptically that she hoped he lived to see their fruition. What precisely was meant by this message, or indeed how Mother Eastrom had become familiar with so esoteric a text at so early a date, is again unclear, though her words could perhaps be said to shed some light on what followed. Within a week of the letter's arrival, Mother Eastrom was dead. At first, when her body was found floating face down in the lake, it was thought that she had fallen in and drowned. It was only when her body was retrieved and the hands and feet found to have been tied that foul play was suspected, and indeed confirmed. In the days following this tragedy, Mother Eastrom's plot was absorbed into the Larsingham Hall estate, her dwelling razed to the ground, and the strange figures cast into the lake, in which she herself had met an unfortunate end. Here one might suspect the story should end, and in such a case the reader would be well within their rights to wonder how these events of centuries ago relate back to the object with which I began my story. To find this link, we must now turn to an entirely different set of records, namely those maintained by the parish doctor upon his visits to Larsingham Hall, during which he attended personally to Sir Arthur. In them he details how Sir Arthur, with increasing frequency, summoned him to the hall on account of agonizing pains he was experiencing within the bones. The pain was such that the doctor was forced to administer what primitive forms of pain relief existed at the time, and which, on several occasions, rendered Sir Arthur unable to leave his bed for several days. As time went on, the frequency of these attacks increased, and there were numerous occasions upon which correspondents of those living and working at the hall mentioned that awful screaming that echoed through the corridors. Also of note are the measurements recorded by the physician, who over the course of the next 6 months noted a decrease in Sir Arthur's height of almost a full foot. A shrinking he identifies as the direct cause of the bone pain and muscle spasms that the great man was experiencing. The records continue in much the same vein, except that over the next 6 months there was a marked acceleration in Sir Arthur's loss of height. Records from other great houses speak of Sir Arthur during the same period and comment on his gaunt appearance, the protuberant nature of his eyes, and the sunken hollowness of his cheeks. Within a year of Mother Eastram's death, Sir Arthur was too weak to stand, and if records are to be believed, had diminished to a height of just over 2.5 feet. His physician notes that although he retained his adult proportions, in terms of size and stature, he more closely resembled a small child. By this point, I trust that the reader will have come to see the link between the legend and the box, and could hazard a guess as to the identity of the box's occupant. Indeed, upon reading the various accounts and piecing this information together, my friend confirmed his suspicions with the parish priest, who, though he recoiled from any suggestion that dark forces may have brought about Sir Arthur's problems, did reveal that up until 50 years ago, the tiny body was stored in a much larger box, and that this current incarnation was the third such receptacle in which the body had been placed, the first being so large as to have filled the recess in which my friend first found the object. The implication, therefore, was that even past the point of his expiry, when his tiny coffin was placed within the nook of the wall, Sir Arthur's body continued to decrease in size, shrinking more and more with every year. It's here that my friend concluded his tale, and where the reader might once again expect that I would conclude my own. Sadly, however, this is not the case. For after concluding his story and draining his glass in a single effort, my friend, somewhat sheepishly, suggested that I should make my bed in his quarters for the night, reminding me that by comparison my own chambers would now be frightfully cold. He had an extra bed and nightwear that would fit me, and was sure that I would be far more comfortable without the burden of dragging myself back to my own rooms. I had just begun to dismiss this idea, though the notion of slipping into my own freezing cold bed did give me some pause, when I caught sight of a strange and hitherto unseen look in my companion's eyes. It was an empty, desperate look, that had I not known better I would have characterized as pleading. Indeed, after a short pause, my friend confirmed my suspicion by adding a hollow, whispering, "Please." Well, what was there to do? No doubt my friend was correct in his assertion that my chambers might be mightily chilly by this point, and this would not in fact be the first time that after burning the midnight oil a little too enthusiastically, I had enjoyed his hospitality rather than travel back to my own home. So, as much for myself as through any desire to be kind, I accepted his offer and began making preparations for sleep. Within an hour, I was huddled in my bed in a room next door to my friend's, and affixed to the study in which we shared the strange story. The study in which I knew the object of that story, the box and the tiny body, remained. Having blown out my candle, determined to sleep, I had for several moments screwed up my eyes and attempted in vain to drive the image of that tiny corpse from my mind. But still, the image persisted. The shriveled, leathery skin, the tiny pearl-drop teeth, and the perfect detail of the fingernails. In bed, in another room, I told myself, I was more than an adequate distance from those tiny fingers. Yet when I turned to my left, facing away from the study and exposing my back to the door, I could not help but feel a strange sort of weight, a small but definite pressure from behind, as if the space were, if not occupied, then certainly surveyed, seen, and looked upon by someone or something that eyed the space greedily and wished, on tiny pattering feet, to scurry hurriedly into it, further and closer toward me. All at once I turned, and facing back towards the door, forced my eyes to look beyond the tiny crack between it and the door jamb, staring into the space I realised that the bottom portion of the door was obscured from view by the edge of the bed, and in noticing this detail, I foolishly allowed my mind to wander. What, I thought, would I do if I were to lean forward and glance down beyond the edge of the bed, down to the space inches from the ground, and see there, in that crack of the door, 4 tiny fingers, slender and pale, curling slowly around the wood? What if, in that minute space, I were to see a figure, the size of a small marionette, standing silhouetted, waiting and watching purposefully? Leaning forward, I glanced towards the door, to the space my mind had filled with horrors, and saw nothing. No tiny figure, no slender fingers with fingernails like diamonds catching the flickerings of light. All I saw was darkness. All I heard was silence. I remained for some moments, sitting up in bed, partly furious for allowing myself to be taken up in such a flight of fancy, partly glad that I had taken the time to look, to check. Again, I glanced towards the foot of the door. In the other room, the gentle, rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock shaved time and silence into small, even slices. I sighed heavily, and determined at last to sleep, turning to adjust my pillow. At just that moment, however, in the very instant that my eyes moved from the door, a second, smaller sound joined the ticking of the clock, and I again turned to look. As before, I saw nothing but the edge of the door and the plains of darkness beyond it, but where my eyes failed, my ears boldly marched. For within the other room there had been a sound, a keening, yawling creak, not of floorboards or wind tugging at the roof tiles, but, I thought, of a hinge, a tiny brass hinge, such as the one that clipped the lid of that awful box closed, and on occasion wailed as the lid yawned open. I sat motionless. Outside, the wind had suddenly risen, as if in chorus with that errant creak. Perhaps, I thought, it is the door of my friend's room, or perhaps my own, moved a fraction by some draught, which caused the strange sound. But it was not. I knew the sound, for I had heard it before, earlier in the night, when I myself with my own hands had eased back that hinge and seen what lay beneath. Reaching slowly towards the nightstand, I took up a match and lit the candle, fumbling it somewhat in the attempt to perform the action without ever taking my eyes from the door and that thin strip of black that joined my room to the one before it. As I shifted forward in bed, moving the bedclothes to one side, I saw from my right another light, the thin, jaundiced glow of a bedside candle, and knew immediately that my friend had also been roused by the queer sound. For a moment I wondered whether he too had been lying awake, his mind filled with terrors, and began all at once to understand his wish for me to stay. Calling him, I asked if he were okay. He replied in the affirmative, and in a moment appeared in the crack of the door, opening it gently and leaving it open so that some portion of the study was now visible, and stepped almost inside. "Did you hear that?" he asked sheepishly, the colour of his face matching in its complexion the waxy, off-white hue of the candle. I nodded, and slowly swung my legs out of bed and padded towards the door to join him. "Do you think," he began, his words interrupted by a splintered cracking of his voice, "do you think it's possible?" Here I raised a hand to silence him, not so much for fear of making a sound, but for fear of hearing what he might suggest. In response, I simply nodded, and knowing, fearing what was bound to come next, I set my jaw, straightened myself up, and walked determinedly out of the bedroom and toward the table upon which the wooden box was laid. I had not gone 4 paces when I felt my legs dissolve beneath me. Across the room, in the candle's pale glow, I saw the edge of the box and the lid flung open. I swear that if I'd have thought my legs capable of carrying me, I would have sprinted from that room and not stopped until I reached the next county. As it was, I was frozen, rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on the box, the lid, and the tiny hand that crawled like a milk-coloured spider over its wooden sides. I would like to say we were brave, that we rushed forward with the confident prayers of churchmen and the imperious confidence of English soldiers. I wish that, but we didn't. Instead, for several moments we both simply stood, the silence and darkness pooling around us, until, from the other side of the room, we heard the tiny wail. Describing it now, trying in the clear light of day to find words, is a task beyond the impossible. The sound was hollow. It had something of the sound of a reed instrument, like a recorder or flute played by an inexperienced child. Beneath this open, breathy exhalation was a tighter, more rigid sound, high-pitched and almost feline in nature. The combination was mournful, pained and achingly hollow. It rang across the quiet of the study like a clarion call, and in its abruptness startled my friend into action, so that he leapt forward, pushing past me, and in a single arcing swipe slammed the lid back down, placing atop it a number of heavy volumes, before hurriedly scurrying back across the room. The awful sound had stopped. A few days later, my friend, with permission from the priest at Larsingham, donated the box and its contents to the University Museum. When asked, the priest would admit that he had never held any fondness for the artifact and believed that Larsingham Hall was in fact better off without it. When pressed upon whether he himself had ever heard anything similar to the sounds we had heard, he simply repeated himself, better off without it. As for myself, I never quite got over the experience. I will admit that owing to a certain reluctance, I have now developed the habit of falling asleep with the candle still burning. In my waking hours, however, I have, alongside my friend, worked to secure an explanation of sorts for our shared experience, and whilst nothing of the sort may ever be truly found, we have alighted upon some details that might go at least some way towards explaining such a thing. It is worth considering, for example, that in the translation of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, undertaken by the esteemed Mr. James, the lines referred to in Mother Eastram's note read, "And when Jesus saw what was done, he was wroth, and said unto him, O evil, ungodly, and foolish one, what hurt did the pools and waters do thee? Behold, now also thou shalt be withered like a tree, and shalt not bear leaves, neither root nor fruit. And straightway that lad withered up wholly." Furthermore, there is the curious fact that when a mischievous young undergraduate sought to gain notoriety by opening the box, against our express instructions, he found it not to contain a tiny body at all, but instead to be completely empty. The withering, so my friend and I assumed, having continued even in this new setting. Finally, there is the matter of the date, the second portion of Mother Eastram's message, and indeed the detail that leaves me to wonder whether the above does in fact constitute a ghost story at all. In her note, responding to Sir Arthur, Mother Eastram wrote that she hoped he lived to see the scripture's fruition. The date of 1709, printed above the recess in which the box was found, refers to Sir Arthur's year of birth. There is no date of death, no confirmation from any physician that Sir Arthur ever died at all. There are only scattered accounts of a pained, mournful wailing as the withering went on and on.